Good evening. This is The Digital Age. I'm Jim Zirin. Tonight we talk about politics. It is no longer news that a little-known Republican named Scott Brown captured Teddy Kennedy's Senate seat in Massachusetts in a stunning upset victory. What may be news is that Brown used an internet technique known as the money bomb and raised as much as $1 million a day, the very technique used by Barack Obama when he campaigned for the presidency. Brown also liberally utilized internet platforms such as Facebook and Twitter in order to energize his base, just as Obama did. So our question tonight is whether the Republicans haven't beaten Obama at his own digital game. And here to help us answer this question is Doug Schoen. Doug Schoen is a leading political consultant of the Democratic stripe. He is the author of a recently released book, which is entitled The Political Fix, in which he argues for a dramatic overhaul in our political system. And Doug Schoen, welcome back to the Digital Age.
Jim, thank you for having me.
Now, just to kick things off, what went wrong with the Democrats this cycle?
Well, pretty much everything. I mean, the Democrats pinned their hopes, not only in November of '09, but in the special election in Massachusetts, on recreating and reassembling the Barack Obama coalition. Very simply, they couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
You were quite prescient about the Brown victory. I mean, you called it on January 12th in the Financial Times, a week before the Massachusetts election. You stated, and I quote, "The Democrats will have to fundamentally recalibrate in 2010 if they want to avoid disaster in the midterm election." What did you mean by recalibrate?
Well, I think they've got to start with things like what the president did yesterday. He said he was going to reach out to the Republicans on health care, hold a town hall with Minority Leader Boehner and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, and to try to find common ground. Well,
that's a half day at the White House.
At Blair House, I think.
At Blair House. Is that too little, too late?
Well, I would say it probably is too little, too late, but it's a start. And Jim, the other thing that I would say that I think is very important, if they insist on using their bill as the only basis for discussion, the bill that passed the House and Senate in slightly different forms, then I think it probably won't succeed. But if they say, look, we have core principles, you have core principles, how do we put them together into a bill that will begin to reform the healthcare system, hold down cost, continue to try to expand coverage of the uninsured, cover pre-existing conditions and the like. If they do that, I think they can succeed and ultimately get the president and the Democrats some credit.
But so far, we've seen that the Republicans have engaged in the politics of no. There's no Republican health care bill, at least none that I've ever seen. They say we should go back to the drawing boards. They say they'll cooperate, but there are no concrete proposals as to how we can curtail costs, which is, of course, the key to it, and have universal coverage.
Well, they do have a couple of ideas, though you're absolutely right to say they've been obstructionist, and the more success they have saying no, the more they've said no. But a couple of their principles are to allow the purchase of insurance across state lines, to have national competition. They've also spoken of tort reform, malpractice reform. So they have a number of ideas they've floated, but you're absolutely right. They have found that just saying no is better politics than saying maybe.
Well, tort reform really isn't going to involve enough billions to do it for them. It may involve some saving. I mean, there's that argument that doctors over tests and that costs rise because they're worried about being sued, but there are all sorts of counter-arguments that are perhaps more impressive or equally impressive. But the question of competition across state lines, the insurance companies don't want that. They have a built-in monopoly.
Well, I understand that, but this is not about what the insurance companies want or even about necessarily what will necessarily achieve the objective. It's about achieving political compromise in a way that moves the ball down the field and advances the interests of the American public. So I think taking from both columns, trying to find something that will in fact enhance coverage, hold down cost, could well be achieved at this kind of a summit. Whether it'll happen, Jim, I think is anyone's guess.
Don't you believe there's kind of a mood in the country now already of throw the rascals out, and it's kind of ill-defined, but maybe it's called the Boston Tea Party, maybe it's called something, but Obama's lost a lot of his independent base, a lot of his liberal base. He's tried to please everybody, and he's alienated a lot of his constituency that put him in office.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, what's happened is throw the bums out, and when you're in control of Congress and the White House, the bums tend to be the Democrats in this instance. In other cases, in 2008 and 2006, it was the Republicans. So the pendulum has swung back, and I think you also put your finger on a very important point. The president hasn't had a consistent philosophy of governing. One week he's a centrist, the next week he's a populist, the next week he's a middle-of-the-road liberal. So I don't think people have a sense where he stands, but what they've decided is they don't much like most of his policies and most of what Congress has done.
One week he wants to rein in the banks, the next week he wants to bail out the banks and extend the bailouts of the Bush administration. It's kind of a very uneven course that he's charted.
It's an uneven course, and I think people on the left and the right look at the banks, particularly Goldman Sachs, and they sort of say, how do we get bailed out like that? We're worried about our home mortgage if we haven't lost our home already. We're worried about our jobs. And somehow, if you're a big institution, you get supported, and if you're a small fry, you suffer. And that's left a lot of people really angry.
You were interviewed by Paul Gigot on Fox Channel News as to what would be the political fix for all this.
What would be your recommendation?
A centrist policy emphasizing fiscal discipline, reducing the deficit, and most importantly, private sector job creation. Unless we do things like a payroll tax holiday, aid to small business, and immediate steps to stimulate job creation in the private sector, we're not going to succeed. The Democrats aren't going to succeed.
Now, you say the Democrats must move to the center. How far to the center must they move in order to recapture their political base?
Well, much of what I said in that interview, the president, in slightly different forms, has proposed. On payroll tax holiday, you have bipartisan legislation that Schumer and Hatch have both supported. The White House indicated over the weekend that they're prepared to entertain it. So I think the answer, though, to your question is pretty darn far to the center, because this is a country that is much more conservative than it is liberal, much more fiscally prudent than it is expansive. And at this time, frankly, it may well be better economic policy than the American people would believe to so-called prime the pump with deficit spending. But most Americans are deeply skeptical of that approach and want to rein in deficits because of their fears about the future.
You haven't become a closet Republican, have you?
I don't think I have. I mean, do you remember, Jim, you may not be old enough, but John F. Kennedy, the tax cuts, I think they were, was it 61 or 62? Rising tide lifts all boats. The whole notion that if you stimulate the economy through tax and fiscal incentives, you could offer greater good for more people. And that combined with a moderate social welfare policy is, I think, where most mainstream centrist Democrats are. The problem is that's a diminishing share, certainly of the elite, if not the mass Democratic audience. And it's hard to make that argument in a way without getting branded a closet Republican or worse.
Well, Kennedy also said failure is an orphan and success has many fathers.
That is true, too. Absolutely.
The liberal policies would appear to have failed.
It looks to me like they have not had the success the president would have wanted.
Do you think he made a mistake tactically and made it a lot tougher for himself by focusing on the health care bill in his first year in office? And perhaps he should have said, what we need to do is create jobs for the American people, and I'm going to emphasize that.
Well, Jim, I remember 1982. I remember October 1982 when unemployment went to 10.1%. I saw the impact on the polls. I think most political advisors would understand that the stimulus not having succeeded in the way they wanted, they had to pivot to jobs and job creation very, very quickly. And by failing to do that and failing to do bipartisanship earlier, bringing the Republicans in, I think have left them politically exposed.
Let's go back to the situation in Massachusetts where Brown ran against Coakley and, of course, defeated her. You said that the Brown victory was a complete repudiation of Obama's domestic policies. But wasn't there something else there as well? I mean, Coakley was a weak candidate, Brown was an attractive candidate, and Coakley was actually leading in the polls until around Christmas Eve, when you had all the backroom politicking in Congress and all the special interest senators getting something for their state or getting something for themselves in order to strike some sort of a deal. Do you think it was the general politics in the nation that accounted for Brown's victory, or do you think it was simply that Brown turned out to be a stronger candidate than Coakley, who took time off and who couldn't spell Massachusetts and thought that Curt Schilling played for the Yankees?
Well, I guess what I would say is if she was just a bad candidate, he was a good candidate, and it was just left to that, she maybe would have won by 6 or 8 points, maybe 4, but she would have won. But this was a larger vote, and you put your finger on it, which is it was a repudiation, as I've said, of what's been going on in Washington, particularly the health care bill, but also I think it was a message to the Obama administration about government bailouts, about the deficit, and it was a way to express outrage with a set of policies and an administration that people felt and feel is out of touch.
Now, of course, Brown said he would vote against the health care bill if it were presented to him in the Senate. But in Massachusetts, there's universal health care, and it's been very successful. In general, people in Massachusetts are pleased with the state health care bill. I mean, why would they vote for a senator who says he's against health care and against a candidate who says she's for it?
Well, I think part of it is that they have a healthcare system in Massachusetts that is obviously somewhat more popular than the proposed plan that the Obama administration, the Democrats in Congress have put forward. That's number one. But number two, I think there was a generalized sense that this bill was going to cost too much, would go too far. And people, even if they were happy with their healthcare in Massachusetts, might have felt that we just didn't need an additional layer. So that being said, there were a whole lot of factors, not the least of which was a sense that this was a way to send a message.
How much would you say the internet was a factor in Brown's victory? I mean, he used the money bomb technique. He raised an enormous amount of money. He was in touch with his base on Facebook and Twitter, and indeed when he threw his victory party, it was a webcast.
Jim, I saw a statistic after the election that just startled me, which is that he had $4 to $5 million in the bank after the election. Now that means that the money was coming in so quickly that he couldn't even spend it fast enough. So I think the answer to your question, given the anecdotes that you cite and what I'm describing, is huge. I think, in fact, one of the strengths of what you do on the digital age is that you get beyond the news and behind the news to look at how the web and digital communications inform, enhance, and structure our daily lives. And I think it's fair to say that but for the internet, we don't have a Scott Brown victory. We have a Martha Coakley victory. And I think really you're pointing to an issue that is hugely important for the midterm elections and the resuscitation, if it happens, of the Republican Party.
Now, you're a keen observer of the political process. You have written about it in numerous books, including this latest one, which is certainly a must-read. Do you think that the internet has transformed the way in which we choose our leaders? And is that desirable, and is it a permanent transformation?
You know, I think it has transformed the way we elect some of our leaders some of the time. I don't think we know enough yet to know the answers to your question. It's entirely possible that how the internet ultimately plays out vis-a-vis the political system will continue to evolve. It's possible that it'll only be isolated circumstances like Howard Dean or Barack Obama or Scott Brown where it plays a decisive and determinative role. But it's also the case that I don't think either party has really harnessed the genie in the bottle and figured out how to use it. But when it does get harnessed, as in Scott Brown's case, the results and impact are cataclysmic.
Now, Barack Obama came to power with a 78% approval rating among the American people. Now it hovers around 53%, it may be slightly less. This is a staggering decline in approval. It's not just the health care bill. In fact, most Americans are kind of indifferent about the health care bill because they don't understand it. That really wasn't explained to them adequately, and it's a terribly complex issue with many, many facets. But you can't say it's just the health care bill. It's a crisis of leadership, isn't it?
I think it's a crisis of leadership, but it's also a crisis of result. I think most people believe that if the deficit were smaller and unemployment were under 5%, Obama's approval ratings would be closer to 60%. And I think really the American people are looking at their lives, Jim, and saying the certain futures that we expect in terms of the values of our home, our employment, educating our kids in our retirement, they've been thrown up for grabs. I know many, many people, I'm sure you do, who've had their lives really almost destroyed by the events of the last couple of years. And I think there are many people who are so nervous and were so hopeful about Obama that the hope that they felt has turned to doubt and indeed frustration all too quickly.
Now, in the early 90s, when Bill Clinton tried to get Hillary care through the Congress and it failed, he dramatically changed course, didn't he? He course corrected.
He did.
In a way that proved to be quite advantageous for him. What does Obama need to do, specifically?
Well, I've suggested he needs basically to reach across the aisle. And he needs to reach across the aisle, one, because he's losing his support rapidly and he can't hold his own coalition together. But second, the American people want cooperation, conciliation, and bipartisanship. And he started yesterday with Katie Couric. Whether it's too little too late, as you suggested, or the start of a trend, time will tell. But ultimately, I don't think his approach, the one that we've seen for the last year or so, offers great prospect for success.
Well, Maureen Dowd wrote that Obama is always at his best when his back is against the wall. And it would certainly appear that his back is against the wall. But and you heard the State of the Union address. He got something of a bounce from that. Maybe the bounce has subsided a little bit since, so he needed a new Super Bowl initiative. But has he really been successful in turning it around?
He's a great communicator, no doubt about that. I mean, he's as good a communicator as I've ever seen, bar none. But to me, it's more strategy and results than communication. So I think the jury is still out, but I'm not at all confident that he's turned it around, as you suggest.
Now, what about the strategy of blaming it all on Bush? You know, Franklin Roosevelt in '36 was still talking about Herbert Hoover, and he won overwhelmingly. Obama made the statement at Northwestern after the State of the Union, we've had only 1 year to make up for 8. And certainly a lot of the deficits are attributable to the trillion-dollar war of the Bush administration, and a lot of the frustration has to do with our incursion into Iraq. Do you think that he's wise to try to shovel the blame toward Bush, or should he just ignore the 8 years that many people feel got us where we are today?
Well, it's a very good question. First, a large number of people still do blame Bush and buy that argument. So it's probably not bad politics to continue to blame Bush. There's a however. Increasingly, elections are referenda on those that are in power and in control, especially when you control all 3 branches of government. So while it's a good political argument, it's only that. It's politics. And what the American people are increasingly saying is, well, we agree with that, but what's your plan? How are you going to fix the deficit, get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and solve our underlying problems with not only healthcare, but the economy and job creation?
Let's get for a moment your overall appraisal of his first year. In the State of the Union, there were these ringing words, we must work through our differences to overcome the numbing weight of our politics. And you've just written a book about the numbing weight of our politics. How can he deal with this as a practical matter?
Well, I think as a practical matter, he has to reach further than he has to try to find common ground, because the Republicans, for reasons you suggested, are increasingly unwilling and unlikely to bend. But what we found with Clinton is that when you reach out to the Republicans, you get political benefits from voters in the middle who say, well, he's reaching out and they're being intransigent. So I think he does have to change his approach. He has to make more and more efforts like the one he's going to do on health care on the 25th. But it's unclear to me how the Republicans will respond or what results he'll get before the midterm elections.
Particularly in light of this populist reaction, because many felt that Bush cared more about Wall Street, rightly or wrongly, than about Main Street. He cared about bank bailouts, which have proved to be politically disastrous. They were endorsed by Obama. Obama, as the candidate of change, has become the president of continuity in the perception of many.
And that's the problem, continuity of policies that are increasingly unsuccessful. And to a very large extent, whether the American people are populist or non-populist, and they are populist, they're also output-driven. If the bank bailouts had produced 3% unemployment and 8% economic growth, those bailouts would have been, much more popular than they are. But that hasn't happened. And the American people are skeptical, they're angry, and they're in a throw the bums out mood.
Now, what about his tactic of ubiquity in the first year? It seemed that a day didn't go by in the first year of his presidency. Maybe it doesn't go by now when we don't read about Obama in the newspaper. John Kennedy said he didn't want to read about what Khrushchev was doing in the New York Times. He wanted to read about what the President of the United States is doing. And I suppose that's worthwhile, but hasn't that backfired on him to some extent?
I think to a certain extent, Jim, you're right. It has backfired. I think that the president needs to more finely calibrate where he goes and when he goes there. I think in retrospect, going to Copenhagen, both for climate change and for the Olympics, were ill-advised judgments. And he's been all over the media, and I think it devalues the presidential brand. And I would think in the future, a little bit less Obama, better thought out, will produce a better result for him and the country.
Do you think it devalued the presidential brand for him to have gone after the Supreme Court on the campaign finance decision?
I thought so. I mean, I'm one of those who very much believes in the separation of our different branches of government. And I'm always upset whether it's a Republican criticizing the court or a Democrat criticizing the court for that to happen. And I guess my reaction, and I'm not by no means a constitutional scholar, I saw the intellectual basis for the decision. I expected it. I have my own trepidations from a policy point of view about what it'll produce. But I must tell you, I thought the president spoke too harshly in ways that were not necessarily consistent with what I would have hoped a president would do with the Supreme Court decision.
Now, a great president, and correct me if I'm wrong or correct me if you disagree with me, but to be great, he must have control of the political narrative.
That's Jim, you couldn't say it better.
And wouldn't you say that there's a narrative vacuum here? Because just as you said at the beginning, is he liberal or centrist? Is he conservative? Is he Bush prime, or is he against Bush? He seems to bob and weave all over the basketball court.
Well, I think you're putting your finger on the key issue. If you don't control the political narrative, events control you. Events have obviously been adverse for the president, and the Republicans have been able to control the narrative, if only by saying, it's not working, it's his fault, blame them. Now, that's not a governing philosophy, and indeed, you've seen probably that the polls that show Obama increasingly unpopular show the Republicans more unpopular still. Now, that doesn't mean that the voters are not going to turn the Democrats out. They will. But what it does mean is there is no alternative philosophy or narrative for the Republicans other than opposition. That's neither good for them nor the country.
Well, it's not a bad strategy for a party out of power, is it?
For a short term, no.
And if they were governing, then not going anywhere would be undesirable. But this way, they kind of make him look weak and ineffectual.
Jim, you've had me on a couple of times, and one of the things you always insist on, and you're going to get it today whether you like it or not, are fearless predictions. And so I'm going to predict here today that there will be a Republican victory in the House and Senate elections, and they'll take control of both next November. And that hopefully, if I am worthy, you'll have me back next year around this time to talk about the Republican congressional agenda and now how that fits with the Democratic presidential agenda going forward for 2011.
Well, that is a date. And Doug Schoen, I have a question for you.
Sure.
And the question is, have the Republicans beaten Obama at his own digital game?
I think they have. I think they have demonstrated that they're ahead of him. He overreached with his Organizing for America. He turned a stealth campaign into a visible campaign. And I think the Republicans now, because of the Tea Party movement and because of the anger that exists on the right, have a constituency that's almost as large, Jim, almost as large as what the Obama organization had in 2008. And I think it remains to be seen. The unwritten, unanswered question of this election cycle is, will the digital divide play to the Republicans' advantage and give us the congressional majority? I think they're going to win.
Doug Schoen, political consultant extraordinaire par excellence. Thank you so
Jim,
much for
thank you
coming
for having
by.
me. My pleasure.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Good night and all the best.